Welcome back to the Speaking and Communicating podcast. I am your host, Roberta Ndlela. If you are looking to improve your communication skills, both professionally and personally, this is the podcast you should be tuning into. Communication and soft skills are crucial for your leadership growth and for your career growth and leadership development. And by the end of this episode, please log on to Apple and Spotify, leave us a rating and a review. Now let's get communicating with Dr. Frank Douglas, hailing all the way from New York. He is here to talk to us about not only his illustrious career in the healthcare sector, but the work he does with DE&I, workplace culture, and helping leaders to help their teams deal with stress and anxiety. And before I go any further, please help me welcome him to the show. Hi, Dr. Douglas.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for the invitation.
My pleasure. I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for being here. We are actually honored that you took the time to be on the show because you must be a very busy guy.
Yes, I am busy, but it's always nice to have an opportunity to share with various audiences, what I do and what my mission is.
Mm-hmm. So please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I was born in what was British Guyana, South America. Came to America in 1963. And it's
Wow.
noteworthy because I arrived in America on the 20th of August, about 8 days before Dr. Martin Luther King's memorable march on Washington. Why
Mm.
that is memorable for me is that I came on a Fulbright scholarship and I was on an orientation program for the Fulbright fellows and scholars at Yale University. And 3 days into this this orientation program, I experienced what I later learned that Dr. King had said during his speech, namely being judged by the color of my skin rather than the content of my character.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my first interaction with discrimination in America. It was a bit of a jolt to me, but I became unfortunately quite familiar with discrimination in America in college, in graduate school, in academia, as well as in the industry, the pharmaceutical industry. And one of
Mm.
the things that I am very fortunate is that I learned in a way how to deal with these episodes. I struggled initially, but finally learned how to deal with them. And that's one of the things I am now working hard to share with others.
Right. I'm not familiar with the country, Guyana, but I grew up in apartheid South Africa. It
Mm.
ended when I was 18, so you could practically say I was a grown up by then. So when you first came to America, are you saying that was your first experience with discrimination?
Well, we had discrimination at home. The lighter complexion blacks uh, tended to get more opportunities, particularly for civil service, government jobs. But one was never treated, as though one didn't have dignity. I never, I came from a very poor background.
Mm.
And as I tell people, I never realized that I was really poor until I came to America, because no one ever treated me as though I didn't have value. So it was a different thing. We understood that yes, the white colonizers, they were at the top of the heap, but they were very few in
Mm.
Guyana. And the lighter complexion blacks tended to have, particularly in the workplace, as I mentioned, in government, civil service type jobs, tended to have a preference. But education was really the discriminating thing, if you like.
Mm.
And if one had done well at the various examinations, one basically had entry to various jobs and various opportunities.
I always find that interesting when I hear African Americans here, some of my friends, and they say that's also prevalent in the community, in that the lighter skinned you are, the better the opportunities. Because back home we used to say, and I have a cousin who's so light skinned, and we used to say, apartheid treated us the same. What's the big deal? So we don't put the lighter skinned one over the others. We were all the same, basically. You're all black. The system says so. So it makes no difference. Yeah. So that's been a different experience for us in that regard. So why did you decide to enter the healthcare industry after you graduated?
It was actually by accident.
Hmm.
And if I may tell the story that was the
Please
initiator,
do. Uh,
after I completed my PhD in physical chemistry, I had a job at Xerox. And for 3 months, I could not get a meaningful project. And then one day, a white young man joined the group. And within a week, he was placed on the most attractive project that we had in research and development at that time.
mm.
I went to have a discussion with my manager, and he was telling me the usual. And I suddenly said to him, Steve, don't think of me as though I'm Frank. Think of me as though I'm Bob. And I was just stunned to see the recognition come over his face as he said to me in a very thoughtful way, he said, Bob has been here a week and I've put him on the artery project.
Mm.
Well, I was furious. I left his office in a fury, ran down to the office of the senior vice president to give him yet another example of my being discriminated against. Now, 2 or 3 years later, as I thought about this, and after I had left Xerox, and as I thought about that incident, something occurred to me. I had missed 2 things. The first was that Dr. Tribus, the senior vice president, had hired 3 young Black PhDs that summer to join the 1 Black PhD that Xerox had at the time. Mm. So it was probably more important to him that Frank Douglas would do well than it was to Frank Douglas, because he was on the line. The second thing that I had missed was my desired outcome. I really didn't want the senior vice president to go and have tough words with my manager. I wanted a good project.
Right.
So had I reframed my problem, and had I asked the senior vice president, had I said, Dr. Tribus, could you help my manager find me a good project? I might have retired from Xerox, because he was 3 levels above my manager. Just imagine if he had walked into my manager's office and said, find the man a good project. That would have happened yesterday. Mm. So that became a very important episode in my life. About 5 years ago, I was writing my memoirs, which are published.
Yeah.
And as I wrote that incident, something occurred to me. And that was, I had learned from that incident, because I then recognized that thereafter I had begun to, what I call now, reframe. I had begun to reframe problems in order to deal with problems. So that I, in spite of all of the discrimination, etc., I ended up being the first Black to be on the board of management of a top 5 global pharmaceutical company.
Wow.
And as a matter of fact, was recognized for that and the innovation that I introduced to the pharmaceutical industry. In 2007, I was a Black History Maker awardee. Mm-hmm. So my passion and mission now is really to bring this process to as many individuals as possible who deal with discrimination.
Well, congratulations on all those awards and achievements, very well deserved. And then the next question becomes, looking back, the reframe methodology that we're going to talk about in detail, we always say, when you hear these self-improvement psychological concepts, we always say, I wish I knew this in my early 20s, this knowledge, these powerful insights. I would have done things way better. Why do I discover them now in my 60s and 40s?
And as a matter of fact, I think it is very important to bring this methodology to the younger people. In fact, I had a very interesting situation about 3 months ago, a young woman who had read my book reached out to me on LinkedIn and said, I'm an expert in information management, and my colleagues like the process that you have. And we don't really have a discrimination problem amongst our chief information officers, but we have a lot of conflict. And we think that this approach that you have outlined and have demonstrated in the book could be used for conflict resolution. To cut a long story short, we actually had about 2 weeks ago a workshop. First, I did a webinar to be sure that indeed it met their needs. And they presented 2 cases, which we adapted to the methodology, and had a workshop in which we discussed the 2 cases. And these were cases of conflicts. And they were really quite surprised and had many, many learnings. So it turns out that not only with respect to discrimination, but having different issues in which there is significant disagreement and conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And that can happen whether you're young or old.
Right.
This is an important methodology to be aware of.
Yes, because conflict, it certainly happens even with siblings you love the most. Conflict will always be there. Your book, which you've mentioned, Until You Walk in My Shoes. Until You Walk in My Shoes. Here's the thing. When it comes to race relations and discrimination, we always say, especially if you're Black and you feel like you're being discriminated against, somebody who's not Black might say you always bring up the race card, which I then see it as, then the issue goes out the window, and then we're not going to deal with what's really happening, because now it has become the race issue and not what's going on, which is, I've been here 3 years and this is the project I was supposed to work on, but a person who's been here only a week gets the better project. Does that make sense?
Yes. And as a matter of fact, when I first published the book in February of this year, it was entitled Addressing Systemic Discrimination by Reframing the Problem. I was in a workshop with 17 other authors, and we were discussing each other's books and presenting to a famous author. And they suggested changing the title for 2 reasons. They said, one, your book is about walking someone else's shoes, and you start off the book by giving a very powerful example of someone not walking in your shoes. So why not change the title? So the title was changed to Until You Walk in My Shoes, with a subtitle, A Reframing Methodology to Overcome Systemic Discrimination. And now the second thing, why, and I've been asked the question, why I don't say racism. And I say, no, I talk about discrimination because whether it is discrimination based on ethnicity, race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, they all start in the same place, namely a bias, be it conscious or unconscious, that devalues another person. And that is discrimination, and it can become very pernicious, particularly when it becomes systemic, namely very unconscious. So I deal with discrimination. And in fact, one of the other experiences I had is I say a young woman, she's an adult now, but when she was a graduate student and I was at MIT, she was doing a, um, a sort of a fellowship internship with me.
Right.
And I heard from her, and she said she had read the book and she had applied it to a problem in her family, and it had worked. And she was so
Mm.
excited. She wanted me to know that.
Which then we are very curious, Dr. Douglas, what is the reframe methodology?
Well, the framework is the following. I believe that every organization, including the family, and you mentioned the family example, including the family, is based on two things: equity and inclusion. Equity is set by the leaders. These are the policies, the rules by which we are going to operate to achieve the objectives of the organization or the things that the family consider important. And inclusion are the behaviors that the members agree to practice, to demonstrate that they value each other, to recognize other's contribution, and to let each other know that they belong. So equity and inclusion is the basis. So that's one piece of the framework. Second piece of the framework is that what I've certainly found in my own experience, personally, as well as in helping others throughout my career, is that in these situations, there's always an individual who is aggrieved. And we may have lots of great programs in the organization to improve sensitivity, to try to improve the environment. But often you will hear an individual say, I have a problem and no one is hearing me.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the focus of this is on the individual, and to make sure, one, the individual is heard, two, that the individual is empowered to find what I call a better problem to solve to get to their desired outcome. In my example at Xerox, a better problem to solve, my desired outcome is to get a good project. Okay. One problem was to deal with the discrimination. Okay. Another problem was, how do I get the senior vice president to talk to my boss to tell him to get me a good project?
Right.
That latter was a better problem to solve. Okay. So
Which means look at the bigger fish to fry.
look at the bigger picture. And in fact, one part of a better problem to solve is not only a problem that will solve the problem of the aggrieved person, but the solution of that problem will also improve the productivity of the work unit and others in the group. So it doesn't just solve my problem if I'm aggrieved, but also the solution helps others around me.
The bigger picture indeed, yeah. So that you don't just make it about yourself, but the bigger benefit of the whole team, the whole workplace.
Yeah. Well, so I tell people, here's the situation. I've been aggrieved, I've been discriminated against. And I go to my manager and I say, I've been discriminated against. Immediately, that manager, no matter how well-being they are, no matter how much they've been trained and being sensitive, no matter how empathetic, they are immediately put on the defense. And so, they have to work through that defensiveness as soon as you say, I've had the discrimination. Now, if you go and you say, here's a problem that's in the group. And I think if we were to solve this problem, it would improve the productivity of the group. And as a matter of fact, if we solve that problem, it would also solve the problem that I have. then that's a different discussion.
So the bigger picture will solve the bigger problem, and then the byproduct is that my individual problem has been solved.
Yes. Yes.
Uh-huh.
And even though, it is my problem and it pains me, etc., if I want a solution in the environment I am in, I have to get the cooperation and the buy-in anyhow for the implementation of that solution.
Right.
So why not find a problem which binds them in at the very beginning so that they are. I give this example. I'm doing a series of webinars at Lehigh University, and they gave a wonderful example actually after doing a couple of cases. And they said, they had actually reframed. And I said, yes, you had. And I said, I'll give you an example that's not dissimilar to yours. When I was in medical school, shortly, I did a Ph.D., worked a year and a half at Xerox, and then went to medical school. And so I was an older student in medical school. I had been a teaching assistant when I was doing my PhD. So I had some bit of little training in being able to evaluate students. So I was rather surprised when I got there to find that it seemed almost routine, at least the last 3 years, that the medical student each year would have 2 to 3 of the 8 to 10 minority students that they had taken in, would have them repeat the first year.
And the reason was?
Well, they said they had not passed critical courses and, etc. And, I complained about it, had a little demonstration, to the board, just myself complaining to the board.
Right.
Nothing was done. And then one day I was talking to one of the top students recognized, and in fact, he was indeed the top student. And he was very upset because he and others felt that some, not all, some of the young women in the class were getting higher grades than they deserved because they were friends with the professors.
Yeah.
And he was very upset about this. And I said to him, have you ever thought about anonymous grading? And he looked at me, I said, yeah. I said, if you went to the dean, you and, a couple of the others, and asked for anonymous grading, I bet you'll get it. So we got anonymous grading. And the following happened. 1, not a single Black student failed a course that semester.
Whoa.
2, one of my colleagues got 3 honors out of the 4 courses. It was on an honors pass-fail system. 3 out of 4 courses. Yours truly got 2 honors out of 4. Not a single Black student failed, but at least we knew 2 white students who had failed. A year later, Black student got 4 honors out of 4 subjects in the first year, both semesters.
When the grading became anonymous.
That's right, had never happened before. But when the grading became anonymous, okay. But there was an idea, there was not an idea, there was an actual example of reframing. The white male students saw the benefit for themselves. And in fact, they were the ones who went and asked for anonymous grading, which benefited us, the minority students.
Why would they ask? What was their motivation behind asking for anonymous grading again?
They were very upset because they felt that some of the the female women students were getting higher grades than deserved because they were friendly with some of the professors.
Ah, right. You mentioned it earlier.
Yeah,
I'm about to say because back home in the college system, when you register for college and they accept you, you get a student number. So every time you write a test, assignment, exam, it's all student numbers. And
that
there's no
is
way a professor can tell that, okay, this student number belongs to what type of student, you know what I mean? It's just a number.
yeah.
So it's kind of anonymous.
Well, no, well, that's how I grew up in the British system,
Mm.
because at the age around 15 and then at 17, 18, we took these exams, which were based on, they were set either by the University of London system or the Cambridge University system. And what would happen is we would get a number. Okay. And one day, you show up, whether it's, well, sometimes there's 3 days of exams, but it was a whole system. You had your number, and you would see them at the end of that's all that would be on your paper, your number. And at the end of the exam, you would see them putting all the papers together, putting them in the big envelopes, etc. And then they get mailed to England. And about 3 months later, it is sent back, and then they unravel, the
That
number.
took a while. Hmm. Right.
You know.
And then let's talk about how we've mentioned examples of applying the reframe methodology in the workplace culture. But what role can leaders and C-suite executives play in this regard?
Well, as I say in the book, leaders are really responsible for the equity part. And one of the things that I do in the book actually is to give some simple ways of assessing equity and inclusion in an organization. So within an organization, you go to the website of an organization, or you go to the annual report, and there are wonderful things that they say about how wonderful their system is, their employees are their number one asset, etc. And then you see that, as a matter of fact, they had a number of cases uh, against them for, be it racial discrimination or gender discrimination. And you wonder, well, how come? So it's important for leaders to be really focused on the equity side of things. And how do you assess equity? Some simple
Right.
things. Are there people in the organization who seem to have privilege? Are there individuals for whom it doesn't matter if they perform poorly, there seems to be no consequence, they're not criticized, etc. They seem to get the favorite projects in life. Is there privilege in the organization? Are there processes that deal with issues of unfairness? Are the personnel processes very transparent, etc.? And the third thing are the prospects, namely, is there a clear relationship between your performance and the opportunities you have for other projects, for promotion, etc.? So just those three things. You look at that, you can assess equity in an organization. And what leaders really have to do is to basically pay attention. And, they do the surveys, etc. But very important, and this is why we are in Safe Haven Dialogues, we focus on the individual, because this gets missed. What leaders do is there may be one or two individuals who, complain. And then they say, but on the average, we have 10,000 employees, there's just one or two complaints, not a problem. Or, okay, we have 100 minority employees, one or two complain, that's 1%. There's really not a problem here. It's just that individual. Well, the reality is that people often will not complain for reasons like fear of losing their job.
Of course.
You know? Okay. So if you take the individual complaint and show that you value that individual and work through that complaint from a viewpoint of what are the issues of equity that individual is facing, what are the issues of inclusion that individual is facing, what therefore is a problem they're facing. Because the reality, and we plot a equity inclusion culture matrix, because it doesn't matter how a company describes its overall culture.
Yeah.
Within any subgroup, there is a culture there. And that culture is often driven, by the frontline supervisor and the co-workers. And that's the culture that an individual is experiencing, regardless of what's said on the website.
Or, when you walk in the beautiful reception desk and they have all these beautiful English words, integrity, inclusivity, everything sounds beautiful when you walk down the company hallways. But as you said, it is usually not congruent with what the actual employees are experiencing.
Yeah. And the reality is what leaders should do is that when those cases occur, is they should use those cases to test whether the things they have on the wall are really real or being
Oh, they just
experienced.
sound nice.
Yeah, no. That's what one should do. One should not say that that individual is an outlier, etc. The reaction should be, we say we're inclusive. This individual is saying they don't feel that they're being included. Well, let's look at how we practice inclusion. Let's see what we can learn from that individual.
Right. Dr. Douglas, one of the things you do, you get asked to speak on these issues. So when you go to conferences and you're the keynote speaker and you talk about these issues, what is some of the feedback you've received after giving these types of speeches?
The questions, and the feedback usually is, and you've sort of touched on it. And in fact, one person asked the question, well, how do you get leaders to participate in something like this if they're not willing? And my response was, you have to seek out willing leaders. If an individual is not interested in being fair and is not interested in being inclusive, it's a punishment to put them through programs to teach them how to do that.
So what's the solution in that regard?
Well, in the solution, ultimately for individuals, well, let me back up.
Okay.
One solution is what we are offering is indeed to deal with for the individual, to deal with the problem, take the responsibility to be empowered, okay, and to go forward, and we give them a way in which to present their case, etc. So we would coach an individual on how to do that, okay? Because if you're in an environment and the environment, the culture is inimical to the way you want to be treated, it is your responsibility to let the culture know that that is not working for you. Okay? Don't sit around and do nothing about it and just be a victim. So that's the first thing that you have to do. The second thing you have to do is you have to look for allies, because invariably you're not the only one who is suffering the problem. There are others, and you may be surprised. Right. So you look around for allies, and then you discuss the example I gave in medical school. My white male classmates became allies. In an issue.
In the grading example you gave earlier, yes.
They became allies. And in fact, rather than us going and making the complaint, we relied on our allies because they had a similar problem, okay, in which they felt they were being treated unfairly. Okay. So you look for allies, and then you look again for what's the better problem to solve. But the key thing is not to be a victim, to be empowered. And that's one of the things which we do. We would take on individuals and take them through the process and help them to find that better problem to solve so they can have that dialogue with their manager.
The better problem to solve, the bigger picture solution rather than the individual.
Yes. What is that bigger problem? What's that bigger picture that includes my problem?
Right. So you kill two birds with one stone, basically.
Yes. Or you kill Big Bird.
Right. Dr. Douglas, is there anything I haven't asked you on this subject that you were hoping our listeners will hear from you today?
At the beginning, you actually mentioned it, and this is really so important because it's underappreciated. A major study was reported around March of this year, in which the investigators from Boston University, they had followed about 20,000 Black women over several years. I think it was 20 years. And what they found was the group of Black women who reported discrimination in their workplace or dealing with the police or dealing with housing, they had a 16% higher incidence of heart disease than women who did not have the same experiences. And what is not appreciated is the impact that stress in the workplace has on well-being and health. And so one of the messages which, I try to tell individuals, even though you may shrug it off and say, well, I don't think it's worth my fighting about it, it is nonetheless taking a toll on your health. And the truth of the matter is, it's taking a toll on your well-being because you take it home. And many times we sort of have to really spend some time just getting the load from work off of us so that we don't react, from the frustration and anger with our family members. So
right. And we don't want to react at work so we don't jeopardize our jobs as well, as you mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. Well, we spend so much time there trying to behave appropriately that we do not jeopardize our jobs, that we can't be, and something we talk about, our authentic self.
Right.
So we spend an awful lot of time being somebody other than who we really are. And that is stressful. But,
and would you say that it negatively impacts your productivity at work as well, which then becomes the cycle of not being your best employee, at work, and obviously affecting your family as well when you get home?
No, it does. And this is why we actually focus on, rather than focusing on DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, we focus on EIIE, that is equity, inclusion, and individual engagement. Because if someone feels they're being treated well, equitably, they're being included, being recognized for their contributions, they feel they belong, they're motivated, they're engaged.
Of course.
So a better metric is, what is the individual engagement? And Gallup has done over 30 years, done tremendous studies, hundreds of thousands of employees in 64 different countries, I think 96 industries, and demonstrated that those companies in which employee engagement was in the top quartile had 24% greater productivity than those companies who were in the bottom quartile. And those companies also in the top quartile had fewer retention problems, fewer safety problems. So from a productivity and profitability perspective, when employees are recognized, are motivated, feel engaged, they produce more.
Yes, absolutely. Those are words of wisdom from Dr. Frank Douglas, the CEO of Safe Haven Dialogues. Thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Douglas. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much.
So please give us again the titles of your two books, especially the one that we mentioned during our discussion.
Yes, look for Until You Walk in My Shoes. It is subtitled A Reframe Methodology to Overcome Systemic Discrimination. But go look for Until You Walk in My Shoes by Dr. Frank Douglas. You can also, find the various things we do, Safe Haven Dialogues, on our website, which is safehavendialogues-llc.com. safehavendialogues-llc.com.
safehavendialogues-llc.com. I will put that in the show notes. Are there any other socials where people can reach you?
Yes, I'm very, very active on LinkedIn. You can find us also on Facebook. It's very active on LinkedIn, on Facebook and Instagram.
I will put that all on the show notes. Thank you very much, Dr. Douglas. It's been an honor to not only listen to your wisdom, but also to learn of the Reframe methodology, and hopefully we can apply it both professionally and personally.
Okay. So have a good Thanksgiving coming up.
You too. Happy Thanksgiving with your family in New York. Thank you so much. My pleasure. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a rating and a review on Apple and Spotify, and stay tuned for more episodes to come.